It's great to be here because I remember so clearly my own first behavioral summer camp, which is I think like the second one ever done because it was at the very beginning of the revolution. And I come back, it was my first year, I come back and I tell my advisors, I want to do something crazy. I would like to apply behavioral economics to development. And they said, what are you going to say to people who say that's not first order compared to infrastructure or schools or any of the other things that development economists work on? And I said, well, I guess we'll see. That's the point of the empirical work. And you know, I had some sense that this would matter because I had spent the year prior to graduate school living, volunteering in a rural community in the Ivory Coast, and seeing, you know, vaccines piled up and no one using them, and technologies that people weren't adopting, and all kinds of decisions that didn't make sense, and policies that I had worked on at the World Bank that were not being kind of taken up at all in the field. And then, you know, imagine the great feeling of coming to graduate school and reading like golden eggs and hyperbolic discounting, thinking about the demand for commitment. But what I saw in the field, and this is, I really, those of you I've talked to, I've really encouraged to do as much qualitative work as possible. Because what was most helpful to me was not only being able to identify behavioral biases while I was in the field and talking to people and understanding how they make decisions, but also feeling out what kinds of informal solutions they could come up with. So I have been living in a community of mainly farmers, which have, you know, seasonal crops. And one of the women I met, so everyone has trouble saving for school fees, right? That's like a chunky expense. One of the women I've met had planted all of her crops at the same time, officially, except for her sweet potato crops, which she had planted to come due when the school fees were due. And I told her, but why would you do that, given that, you know, there's some, you know, efficiency gains to harvesting at the same time? And she said, no. If I do, then all that money will get spent. I make sure that that only comes to harvest when the school fees are due. Then I met another woman who had a lockbox in her house whose keys she had given to the neighbor, and she had to go and ask the neighbor every time. So we took those examples and designed a commitment device in the Philippines to basically, as you know, David kind of teed this up really nicely yesterday. As you know, kind of demand for commitment is kind of a smoking gun for hyperbolic, present biased, time consistent preferences. Not completely, you know, there's also a lot of other things that would predict a commitment device and take up of a commitment device. But here's kind of what we wanted to do. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the design of it, because as you can see then, you know, I'm going to just to give you the overview of what I'm doing today. I kind of chose four areas where I thought, you know, behavioral economics had a very significant dialogue with development economics, but also in the spirit of what we're doing today, that the dialogue would go the other way as well. That what we've learned in applying and testing some of these ideas would then, you know, hopefully feed back into theory. And that's the dialogue that I hope you will all, whatever you're doing, be engaged in. That's part of what's been fantastic about behavioral economics, is the marrying of theory and theory. So on the demand for commitment, so we designed this product that had a withdrawal restriction. So basically the client chose the goal. That was an important distinction. We had a debate. You know, this is a poor community. Actually, we had a lot of pushback from development economists, and microfinance at the time was focused entirely on finance. What would you be doing taking liquidity away from poor people? And when you ask people, they say they don't save enough because they don't have enough money. But then if you ask a little further, and especially if you use words like, have you ever been tempted? Then all the stories come out. Okay, so we designed this kind of together with people on the ground, on allowing them to choose. So not dictating what they should save for, but allowing them to choose what they wanted to save for. And then making the goal either an amount before which the bank would not let you take out the money, or a date. So a lot of people are saving for Christmas or graduation. And again, you sign a contract with the bank to not let you withdraw the money. So basically it looks like the sweet potato harvesting. And then that was the withdrawal restriction. That's the kind of main strong commitment on that side. And then there was a deposit incentive. So this was actually also based on what people were doing on the ground. They had these financial boxes, which were essentially lock boxes. And so that kind of provided a deposit incentive. It also provided a reminder to some degree. If this had been more advanced, we would have done automatic transfers. And you'll see that actually a lot of, we had significant impacts on average, but a lot of people didn't actually use the commitment device. And this is a theme you're going to see once commitment devices make their way through every aspect of development economics. And a lot of it is because there's nothing on the deposit side or on the kind of incentive side. Okay. The last thing that we did in designing this was that, this is ordinarily in a bank, this is taking liquidity away, and that loss of liquidity would in a market be compensated. So the interest rate should be higher. But again, we were at the beginning of the revolution. So this was like 2003, 2001, maybe even when we started the experiment. And so we knew that even if, so the regular interest rate for a regular savings account at this bank is 4%. I know that's really high, but in the Philippines, that's what it was. We knew that even if we said 4.05%, economists would say that's why people put their money in there. So we really had to make almost people pay to some degree for using the commitment device to be able to see whether they really demanded it or not. So this is a distinct sample. It was people who were actually already banked, but weren't using their accounts very much. And what we did was a randomized controlled trial where we randomized the clients into this commitment savings product, where we offered them the commitment savings product, a regular savings product, 4%, and an encouragement to save. Because what we found was that, the process of offering, we wanted to randomize by individual, the process of offering door to door could in itself, banks coming to you, could in itself have an effect. So that was the placebo, and then a peer control. And prior to that, separately, we had a very separate team doing a survey, and there we measured people's time preferences. And again, this was at the beginning of our understanding of measurement of time and consistency. And I think there's been a lot of progress since in terms of how we would want to do this. Here we did it hypothetically, but making people imagine the amounts of money and what they would do with it, et cetera. And then we were able to categorize people into, fully patient today and tomorrow. So it's like $10 today versus $15 tomorrow. You all know the time preference experiments. Fully patient, fully impatient, present bias, time inconsistent, which is who we're looking for. And then this other category, which is kind of in the other direction. And about 27% of people were in this present bias, about 11% were in this other kind of off diagonal. Those are the people who took up the commitment device. So that was kind of a good test that this is actually part of what's going on here. There was a 28% take up along with treatment, and it's predicted by these present bias, time and consistent preferences. You all remember the theory, it's only if you're sophisticated, right, that this would actually demand commitment, and if you have these time and consistent preferences. It turns out that it's only women that have time and consistent, present bias, time and consistent preferences that take up. And then I had some follow-on papers that recognizes the cultural role that women play in the household that requires them to internalize. They're basically a savings commitment. And so if they have the problem, they have to be sophisticated about it. And then what we found was that there was a significant increase in savings over this time period for people who were offered the commitment device. That's an average, again, a lot of heterogeneity. Okay, since then, there's been, people have applied the commitment device to smoking, to under adoption of agricultural technology, labor, yeah.
I think it would be useful to just say a word. I remember in this paper, you addressed the issue that's closely connected to what you were just discussing about the difference between self-control and other control,
yeah.
Right? And given that women were in the position that you're describing, the other control thing, a significant issue. So
yeah.
How do you speak?
Yeah, so I went on the market with 2 papers. This was one of them, and the other paper was called spousal control in the same setting. And because these would both basically, if you if you have a partner who is going to spend the money you bring home, you have to keep it away from them. So it's like the two selves, but either inside of you or inside the household. And as I mentioned, in the Philippines, there are very clear roles where actually even in the marriage ceremony, husbands hand the money over to their wives. And from when they're small, boys are raised to kind of be out there, and they're supposed to be playful and present bias, and women are raised to be responsible. And so, so in this case, the reason we think that it is more of driven by, you know, hyperbolic preferences is simply because of this correlation, this prediction from the preferences. But the fact that it is women who take it up suggests that there's that dynamic in the household is creating an awareness of one's own challenges in self-control. You know, my reading of all of this now, because there's now been, I haven't kind of put on the papers that deal with spousal control, but there's been a lot of work in that area as well, is that both of these things are present. And it's useful actually, as including, you know, Doug's own work and Golden Pessendorfer, these other ways of thinking about our two selves are useful to think about both within ourselves and within the household. Is that where you were thinking about now? Yeah.
I just want to pause a little bit on the welfare question here. So as you mentioned, there is a big trade-off between kind of flexibility and kind of and constraining your future self, which means that commitment contracts are not necessarily optimal for a lot of people. And then it's possible if you layer some kind of naivete on top of that, you know, you could have a situation where people with the lowest levels of the present focus parameter might actually be made worse off by commitments because they kind of lock it up. And they think they're not going to do other things to undo it, but then they do other things to undo it, like they come possibly at that,
right,
and so forth. There's also kind of, you know, as I'm discovering some of my work, a lot of people are confused and just kind of like take on commitment contracts for other reasons that are orthogonal to time preferences. You know, there's sometimes this implicit ideal preference way of thinking about the benefits. You know, people take it up and they say more needs that maybe they're better off, but it's not so obvious at all, given all of these considerations. So what's your view? What's going on? Do you think we increase the welfare of these individuals, or, you know, is this something that we need additional measures for?
Yeah, so just on the additional measures, we did household surveys 2 years down the line, and we looked at total income and payday loans, all the payday loans. Here was and part of the reason for this was they have 5 6s, which is you take out 5 today, you owe 6 tomorrow. And so really high interest rate payday loans. Anything else, consumption, we were looking at for every other measure of welfare, subjective well-being, et cetera. And we didn't find any crowd out in that sense. However, other people have. And I was just thinking about this hypertension paper as well, where, you know, they're generally, I think what we found is that people are partially naive, even when they're sophisticated, or they could be, you know, stochastically sophisticated. And depending on the design of the contract, you could have a situation where people end up putting a lot of money thinking they're going to do this, and then they don't do it. And then they end up foregoing that money. So anything that's like a bomb, that can be very, I think, welfare reducing. Particularly because, especially if you're working in these settings where people are not very educated, they might be taking signals from your offering of this contract, because maybe this is a good thing for me and you think I should do it, and the bank will be more likely to offer me a loan or other things. And so actually that's my, you know, big caution about using anything, including defaults. Right? So even the default where we think, oh, that's, you know, people have a choice, they can opt out. But in a developing country setting, the default is signaling something about what the government wants to do, about other things, and that may actually have its own effects. So all to say that here, we were quite worried about all of these welfare questions largely because this was the big discourse was, microfinance is all about microcredit. This is, why would you do this? And the reason we did this was people in the field were asking for it and doing it to some degree. So were the people who we saw doing it, that was enough. Or if we offered it in the market, would other people also be made better off? And here what we did is we did 2 pilots. The first pilot, we actually allowed it to be super soft. So basically, for any reason, you could take out the money. So you set a goal, you signed a contract, but you could come to the bank and say, I need the money. And when I've been telling some of you that actually David was the one who always told me to debrief every one of my subjects from the first pilot I do. So I still try to do that somewhat. But there I did, and we had focus groups, and they all said, could you please make this harder on us? Because I can come for any reason. So can you, and they said, but we don't want to create a situation where you can't take out the money, you're taking out a loan instead. And they said, no, we'll know because we have this other account. So we know, but it requires them to know. So we did a little bit of, when we offered it to them, we said something about, this is a situation where, you're going to put the money in and then you won't be able to take it out. So you need to think carefully about that. But they themselves were the ones asking for more commitment. For hospital, so the actual hardness of it was you either needed a hospital bill or something that said you moved out of the barangay, or you write a letter to the bank manager. There weren't any fees. But obviously with lots of commitment movement devices, there are fees and people lose money. And that's where we need to be really careful.
Sorry, but even with choice of restrictions, to the extent that there's fungibility and you can undo them through other methods of borrowing and so forth, that puts them then closer to the category of fee-based commitment devices as well, because it's hard to come up with a true choice at
right, and it's true because what is a commitment? It has to be costly somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's the whole point of it. But that design, and there's kind of some great papers trying to really trade off the value of flexibility and liquidity versus commitment. And you're totally right to point out that this is deeply related to how much people understand of their own needs. And I don't know how else to answer it other than to say we measure everything we can possibly measure that we think is related to welfare. And I think everyone should. But they haven't. They haven't. And I also think that, it's really, there's like this kind of puzzle because, there was this great thing like, wow, a little bit like Elizabeth was talking, like, wow, low cost way to help people save, and this is great, and like we should do this everywhere. And of course, often in developing countries or in poor settings, you see people, having this feast or famine mentality, so you think this is going to be the solution. And in fact, it hasn't scaled either in terms of policy or in terms of private sector in the way that you might expect even if 30% of the population had these kinds of preferences. And I think part of that is because it is actually quite a tough thing. The other part is that I don't think we've thought deeply enough about time preferences, so that's where I'm going next. But yeah.
And one more thing.
Yeah.
I'm interested for you to comment. So you mentioned this really interesting fact from your debrief about how these people kind of knew they had some kind of self-control potentially or time inconsistency issue, and that's why they were asking for it. Now that feels different from what we kind of see from some of the modern lab experiments, like Ogden, Bliss, and Raven, where the finding is almost complete unawareness of self-control problems or time inconsistency. So just kind of extrapolating very loosely from kind of that and what you just said. I think it's fair that kind of like when the stakes are higher and people have lots of experiences, that kind of leads them to start learning a lot about and we shouldn't extrapolate too much from kind of the measures of naivete that we have in more artificial settings.
That's right. And this is highly related to the whole dialogue between kind of when we think about decision-making under poverty and under scarcity, right? So on the one hand, a lot of the attention has been given to cognitive bandwidth constraints, making worse decisions. But what Dmitry's pointing to is what I think the wealth of evidence is pointing to, which is that actually the higher stakes, the more constrained environment makes it very clear to you when you have these biases, and because it becomes much more like life or death, and you gotta find out what to do. And what we were trying to do in offering this was to say, who are the people in this environment who have faced this problem and found their solution? And how do we make that more readily available to other people? Okay. So this goes nicely into the kind of second area, which is that when we think about time preference, as economists, we're used to thinking about these discount factors that we're talking about for the last few days. And in fact, in kind of the beginning of economics, that's not the way we thought about thinking about the future. So this is Bohm-Bowler. Provision for the future makes no inconsiderable demands on our intellectual strength. So this is not a preference so much as a capacity. Demands on our intellectual strength. The present always gets its rights. It forces itself upon us through our senses. To cry for food when hungry occurs even to a baby. But the future we must anticipate and picture. So more recently in economics, there has been, a formalization of this, and Gabex has a very nice overview chapter in the handbook that Doug edited, showing sort of that behavioral inattention can explain a lot of phenomena. In particular, he thinks about hyperbolic discounting and projection bias. And then, there's this wonderful paper. The 2017 version has a model in which, as if discounting is generated by imperfect forecasting, that comes just because agents are experiencing signals that are noisy but accurate on average. And the farther out you go, the variance in signals can be large, and the farther out you go in the future, the variance is larger. So this is just signal that you're getting. In their revisions, they've been doing models with scenario simulation. So it'll be great to see like the new version that's coming out here. And the reason for that is that this is a good way of thinking, like, okay, we have to anticipate and picture this thing that's fuzzy and in the future, and that's why we discount it, right? But then if you continue on this quote, it tells you even more about what the process could be, which is we must be able to form a mental picture of what will be the state, that's kind of a projection bias problem, of our wants, needs, feelings at any particular point of time. And we must be able to form another set of anticipations as to the fate of those measures, which we take at the moment with a view to the future. So that's mental scenario simulation. If I do this, what will happen? If I do this, what will happen? So you need that to be vivid and precise and to go through all of the if-then in this process. So it makes no inconsiderable demands on our intellectual strength to do this, right? And it doesn't seem like it's just sort of exogenously given to us. Interestingly, there was a paper from 1997 of Gary Becker and Mulligan that thinks about this as a capacity, and in particular says, okay, well, if it's a capacity, then there should be a rational incentive to invest in this capacity to appreciate the future, to reduce the degree of discounting. And they allow the fact that probably in rich families or in educated families, there's a lot more talking about the future, a lot more making details specific and precise, and then they do it more naturally. And that, of course, opens the door for really thinking about potential types of traps and deep implications for inequality that arise because there is an underinvestment in this. And that I want to take even further beyond the rich and the poor to talk about then how trauma can affect the brain in making this kind of anticipation and picturing. To understand that, we need to understand a little bit about how that mental picturing happens. When we anticipate the future, what's happening? So neuroimaging studies of perspective brain show that imagining future events, you draw from your memory, right? That it basically recruits the same part of your brain when you're thinking about the future as when you think about the past. And then you have to recombine these elements. So what does trauma do? It creates a sense in which the memories become overgeneral. And so everything in the future that you have to think about, either the trauma will shut down future thinking because it triggers negative affect from the past, negative memories. And you get this overload, essentially, that therapists who work with PTSD have to deal with, is of their memories. And that leads to what is called in the literature a foreshortened sense of the future. Or sort of you really think about things in this non-specific overgeneral way. So you could even think about the future, but it's really being driven by things that may not be relevant in your past. And so, this mental time travel that Barbara was talking about, and we've been kind of starting to address in the economics literature, requires the capacity to flexibly reconstruct details to simulate or kind of pre-experience future events mentally, and that becomes much more difficult for you. And so you get this murky, vague, non-specific thinking about the future that looks a whole lot like present bias discount. So what we've done is, over the past 5 years, we have been working in Colombia, which is a setting with over 8 million people who have suffered displacement and conflict. So they have very high trauma. And I had the incredible honor of meeting Emily Holmes, who's on this paper. She's a professor of neuroscience and a professor of psychiatry. And her work is on trauma and imagery. And I'll tell you a little bit more about all of the science she's done on the role of imagery in decision-making, and particularly in helping people with trauma. And the thing is, like in Colombia, as in many countries, there are all these reconstruction efforts with all kinds of credit and training to help people restart their lives. And then actually sometimes there's also mental health interventions, but the problem is these are kept separate. A little bit in the way that we think of these things as separate. But they're not separate, of course, as we just learned. And so what we tried to do was design a curriculum that took a long time, again, in this sort of cogeneration process that we were doing on the ground, with these imagery-based learning techniques. And this is with Brian, Alexa Delfino, Emily, Leah Bakani, and Ashley Popel. And it's been a long time when most of these have gone from PhD student to assistant professor. But the key is to, we took all the best things we knew about traditional business training. And by the way, business training has the same quality as the discussion yesterday about financial training. Quite mixed effects to negative. But there are some things that work, like rule of thumb. And so we took the best of what we know that works in business training, and we embedded basically this imagery-based learning, where you imagine future scenarios, and in particular, you imagine all the steps. So, you imagine what kind of entrepreneur you'd like to become and what it would be like on a day-to-day level to do that. You then start to thinking about the product, and then you start doing the perspective taking of imagining the customer, because by the way, that's also similar parts of the brain. And then you start imagining yourself going and getting a loan and getting rejected by the loan officer, and then what would you do? These are the kinds of things that we embedded into the teaching about how to calculate your profits and save and get credit and that. And the three things that we think are really working that imagery is doing, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the science under each of them, is mental scenario simulation. It enhances emotion as a motivation amplifier, I'll talk about that, and it helps with memory consolidation. Okay, so this is, the way to think about what imagery does. So imagery, the way Emily taught, and I'm just channeling Emily here, we can think in either words or images. At any moment, we're thinking in either words or images. You can switch between them. But images are much older, right? From an evolutionary point of view, we've thought about images a lot longer in images. And so they're kind of faster. And when we think in an image, it's essentially like perceiving something, like with our eyes, with our other senses. And so, for example, a lot of the imagery exercises that we did with people required them to recruit all their senses, because that is how you get from here to here. So there is a way in which you can make this that strong, basically. And you know, athletes have been doing this forever, right? So this is the guy who climbed El Capitan by mentally simulating every single step and every possible scenario in his head, hundreds, maybe thousands of times before he scaled it, right? And that's why it works. It's because it's actually similar to the real experience. And that's, you know, again, on the debriefing, when I asked participants what did they in the pilot, what did they like about it, it's so practical. Like, you know, what I saw was they were sitting there closing their eyes, like imagining something. But for them, it was like practical experience. And it turns out that people with less experience in business are actually improve a lot more from this. Okay, the second part, so that was the mental scenario simulation aspect of imagery. The second part is about emotion. So compared to verbal thought, mental imagery has a more powerful impact on emotion and specificity of thinking. I actually want to take this opportunity to say something about financial training. So I was involved a lot in it before this becomes the savings product and before actually. And it's clear that financial decisions for a lot of people have emotion attached to them. But most of our trainings kind of really shunt that to the side. And you could even see this here when we started in the traditional training, I just was looking in the pilot, when people would write down their profits and then they would just stop calculating. Say, I don't know how to do this calculation. What are you talking about? It's just because they were starting to see that they were making zero profits. It was too painful. Avoidance. So what imagery does is it kind of forces you in this setting to actually confront the emotions that arise in any scenario, and then to see what you would do. So we had both negative and positive scenarios. And again, we think of emotion as something that can get in the way of rational decision making. But under the Holmes framework, it's actually a very powerful driver that can be harnessed. And then finally, and this is the kind of some of the evidence behind that when you simulate engaging in planned activities, it has a larger impact on your ability to carry out those activities and on your self kind of reported motivation. What we find is that imagery increases both the use and the quality of business images. So what we have there is measures that you can use to see how well people are using imagery. You give them scenarios and you ask them about the vividness, the precision, the emotion of their scenario. So it's self-reported, but in our baseline, it's highly correlated with business success, with outcomes and that kind of thing. So the question here was, can you teach it? Is it malleable? And is it causal? And so the first thing we need to see is, yeah, can you teach it? And it looks like you can, but it's domain specific. It doesn't cross over to other domains, only on business imagery. And then downstream, people in the imagery treatment do significantly better on economic outcomes. And that is far more for people with trauma and for women. And it, you know, the traditional, which is really the verbal and analytic, it turns out it actually crowds out some of the imagery. So those people actually do worse than the baseline on imagery, because it kind of puts, it says in this business, in this scenario, in this domain of business, you should be thinking like this, verbally, analytically, etc. Okay. Yeah.
This is so interesting. Now that I have 100 questions for you. But one thing I was thinking, just your last slide, on the question of why it is that people with this trauma then can't see the future in the same way. How much of this do you think is about feeling that you have control over your own future? And like when you had a shock or when you had, I don't know, a COVID pandemic, hypothetically, you kind of are trained to believe that you don't have control over your future actions, therefore you want to risk.
So we measured agency and locus of control. For women, it does actually go up. And we actually did pre and post COVID, so we can see how people have responded to COVID shots. So for women, it does go up. And I think more generally, that's a mechanism. Even though we only find it for women, but I actually think that it is broadly a mechanism, because that when you do this mental scenario simulation, you're the protagonist in the story. And so that feeling of being the protagonist in your own story, I think, can lead to overcoming the helplessness that arises when you're facing someone with exogenous shocks. Yeah.
Can you say about what the training is like? How do you train people to improve their skills?
Yeah. So we always had a psychologist and a business trainer, and they were both trained by Emily. And essentially, so for example, when you do this, the first thing is on, we want you to think about the area of entrepreneurship that you want to go into. And so the first thing you do is imagine being a fisherman. And now you need to you're waking up at 5 a.m. and it's extremely detailed. So we give them, we take them through a kind of guided visualization, and you feel that you sense the smells and you do this. And then we ask them to do it themselves. And then we do the same for each level. So for the product design, we imagine a customer coming in, and imagine a customer not being happy with what you've done. What will you do there? And for the profits and savings, we have, imagine you don't save enough and you have a health shock. What are you going to do? But you take them through, not in this verbal way, you actually have, and that's what I'm saying, it's a little, but I mean, you sit, you breathe, you close your eyes, you're doing meditation essentially. You're in this other kind of, and then you start picturing this thing. So you're trying to get people away from the verbal analytic way and really get them to use images, but images by which we mean all the five senses.
How long is the training? Is it regular meetings?
It's 12 weeks. I just didn't go through all the details, but I'm happy to. And yeah, it's 12 weeks and probably 3 times a week. It's not a very long training compared to others. And that's my general experience with all of various trainings, is that you've got to find the right hook. But once you do, you don't actually need a lot of time. You just have to, yeah.
So first, did you get there any estimates of time preference since you know this training?
No, we didn't actually, because for 2 reasons. Both because of the challenges that have arisen in the literature on measuring, right? So we have some sense that measuring in terms of labor is probably okay, but it's not so easy. The second is that it's not clear that it should change, actually. So even though I've sort of motivated this by saying attention is the underpinning of time preference, but I don't know if time preference, the way we measure it, is the right way to think about it. And it is kind of and that's in another domain, so I do think it's domain specific. Annette, John, and Kate Orkin have a paper where they helped people visualize, use visualization for using water purification treatment. And there they do find some effect on savings. But so we do, by the way, I should say, we find effects on savings and on credit, getting credit for your business in terms of the outcomes. But we didn't measure the time preferences because of all of this other stuff. And actually, I talked to David about it. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to pester you with the welfare question.
Sure, great. I mean, it is, after all, the April public.
But let me say, here's the illustration that's driving the intuition. So what I often have to deal with is a 4-month-old that's just overstimulated by the imagery around him. So he's distracted from eating,
yeah.
He's distracted from sleeping, and then it's just like a disaster because there's just too much going on there. That suggests that these kinds of mental imagery simulation exercises might also be taking away from other things where we can direct our attention. We have a limited mental budget. So when people are doing this, they're not doing something else potentially. Is that,
Yeah.
you know,
Let me,
something we should be kind of account for?
because, you know, we have these downstream effects on income, right? And then we're asking, like, what are the intermediate outputs that led to an increase in income? And something that is suggestive towards what you're saying is that the people in imagery are doing much more marketing activities, like going to customers, going to competitors, getting more credit, having more savings, but doing less record keeping. So I think you're right that there is some crowd out of this. But the reason why I wouldn't do the analogy to your 4-month-old is I think your 4-month-old is a little bit more like the trauma victims who have just a bombardment of images where they haven't been, it's difficult to actually discipline them, to harness them, to point them towards something that would actually be useful. Instead, it's just a bombardment of stimulus. And that's why I think you see trauma victims shutting down, because in fact, they have too many images in their head.
Yeah, right. But the broader point, I think, just to kind of conceptualize this a little more, is with any kind of lever, there's kind of the partial equilibrium effect, which is the domain that where we're deploying it. And here you kind of have the financial domain that you're exploring with incredible detail. But then we wonder what happens to all of the other domains where people are making decisions and so forth, and kind of with any kind of a kind of bandwidth using intervention, and I think this is one of those. There is always the question of what happens to the bandwidth left over in completely other domains. So for example, what's going on in people's personal lives, or kind of all these other potentially consequential decisions outside the financial.
Yeah, I would argue that the same could be said for the placebo. So when we take people through traditional business training, why would that also be the case? A bunch of analytical ways in their head and words they need to work on. And so that it's helpful to have a placebo here. But yeah, absolutely. We always want to know about the overall. But it's hard. Most of these field experiments are partial.
So I have a comment and question. Comment is to follow up on thinking about welfare. And it's just an observation that, you know, yesterday we talked about the non-functional problem. The idea that, you know, if the act of choosing is in your utility function, that creates a fundamental problem of choice-based welfare analysis. And this is encouraging people basically to make that happen, which makes it extremely hard to evaluate welfare. I mean, you know, it's hard to even imagine doing avoidance kind of design with this, having people choose about whether or not they want to use imagery. Because it's like, are you supposed to use imagery to decide whether you're going to imagine yourself using imagery? So I think some of the welfare issues are going to be very tough. So that's the comment. The question is, do you?
Can I make one small comment on that?
Sure.
I think, you know, I think the number, I don't know exactly right. I think it's like 80 million or something spent on business training around the world.
Yeah.
So this is happening anyway. I think whatever welfare calculation we have to compare to the contractual or the status quo.
Oh, no, sure. It's just that doing that requires an apparatus that, while we're working on that problem, don't really have a great apparatus. So it was just an observation. The question is whether you can manage to say more about mechanisms. And here's what I mean by this. When I'm thinking about, you know, the guy climbing the face. Yeah. And there are two things going on, I think, at least two things. One thing is he's trying to make a decision about where to put his hand next. Okay, that could be one thing that's going on. And he goes through the imagery of saying, okay, if I did it here, I could see myself filling up. If I did it here, you know, I go through the imagery of falling off the cliff face. Now, maybe that's, you know, what he's doing, or alternatively, it could be that I am envisioning, you know, putting my hand in a particular place and just thinking about how that would feel and seeing myself, pulling myself up. And what I'm doing is reducing anxiety, you know, getting comfortable with this course, which is not about the choice itself. It's about getting, as I said, it's more about getting comfortable with my choice and confidence in my choice.
It has emotion related to it, right? Whereas the other one, you could just plan out.
Certainly. So is there any way to say whether this is about helping people simulate different courses of action and choose between them, as opposed to simulating one course of action that they then understand more clearly and therefore execute better?
Trying to think what would have that help answer that.
So one thing is really about choice. and the
Yeah,
other is-
Yeah, I mean, because the answer to your question is that the act of thinking about these alternatives, which is what you did, the mental practice that athletes do, is on all the different scenarios. It's not just whether, but it's also when I do this, I feel this,
Yeah.
right? And so it has to come with that. In order for it to kind of consolidate into memory. That's the kind of thinking on that from the mental practice of from athletes.
So that's implementation.
It's implementation, and it feels like, okay, I've done that. What I can tell you is there have been studies where people have done visualization for the outcome, like imagine yourself successful, imagine yourself, and actually it's demotivating for people put in less effort because they're like, oh, I already achieved it. I don't need to do anything. So this is really about the step-by-step thing, but it's like when you're doing the steps, you need to feel those. So the only piece that I currently have to speak to that is that we ask them about both negative and positive scenarios, that they will raise those scenarios in the surveys afterwards, and then ask them about the vividness of the precision and the vividness of emotion. And both in positive and negative scenarios, people have more emotion. So they're thinking through negative scenarios and experiencing them more, and the positive ones. We thought it might be more about, bringing down the negative, bringing up the positive. But when I talked to Emily about the results, she said, no, this makes a lot of sense, because the point is they're supposed to, in this situation, be able to experience these emotions that would be attached to it. Again, with this projection bias idea of overcoming projection bias to be able to actually know what would be the right thing to want to do in that situation.
Yeah, it seems like that differentiates this kind of treatment from like a regular communications intentions. Where are you going to be? You want to vote? Where are you going to be before? What bus are you going to take? And what, which is the same idea, but without the emotion.
Exactly.
And so there is that conflict. Someone here could run the study to separate out in a pure implementations intention exercise with no emotion.
Right.
To the visualization component, which would separate out the scenario.
Right. Absolutely. Can I get a time check? Just because we have two
Yes.
other areas.
We've got 12 more minutes.
Okay.
This morning we do need to I can stick to that statement.
Okay. I'm gonna let me think what I want to do. I'm gonna just very quickly go through. I added this for you guys because of the first question on the first day about what do you do and what do you do with people who have the wrong beliefs. And certain beliefs are harder to change than others. Okay, cultural beliefs, superstitious beliefs, beliefs that are motivated, and they can hinder social learning. So we have a paper that documents this in the aspect of maternal mortality, where it's a very common belief across all of sub-Saharan Africa that if a woman dies in childbirth, it's because she was promiscuous during pregnancy. This is how we uncovered this belief. We were teaching men, because we had this other project looking at different preferences where men want to love children. Then we wanted to teach men about maternal mortality risk. So in the pilot, I stand up and say, okay, well, as you know, 1 in 27 women in Zambia die in childbirth over their lifetime. And then all the men put up their hand. We did this separately. All the men put up their hand and say, oh, that's because they were promiscuous during pregnancy. And I didn't understand what to say. Because I was like, and then I asked, our team, and they said, okay, this is a cultural belief. And I said, oh, well, okay, that's a myth. Let me show you the science. That did not work at all. So we experimented with what is a way to address this. And it is certainly not to say your beliefs are wrong. Let me show you the right stuff. Instead, what we said is 1 in 110 women in South Africa die in childbirth over their lifetime. And then they said, oh, well, those women are different from our women. So if that is consistent, that's data that's consistent with their mental model. Then we say 1 in 43 women in Zimbabwe die in childbirth over their lifetime. So wait a second. We think there's a big competitiveness between Zimbabwe and Zambia. Those women, we think, are more promiscuous, and yet they're dying at a lower rate. What's going on? And then we start with, let's show you some of the other things you can do to decrease maternal mortality. And I'm not going to show you what we actually do. You know, pregnancy goes down, life satisfaction, happiness in their marriage, and their sex life goes up. That's all fine. But I just wanted to show you that about the beliefs. And again, I really encourage working with people on the ground on this. Last bit I want to share with you, because this is something that, you know, for most of what we've seen, behavioral economics has been great for development. This is not an area that's been great. So, you know, there's a sort of large literature in behavioral economics on crowd out. And this literature, I mean, many of you know it, so I'm not going to go into it. This literature has actually had a significant impact on policy discourse. You may not think this, but I was sitting in the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, and he tells me, but we know from all the behavioral economics literature that any financial incentive will crowd out for social motivation. So, you know, how do we know this? Well, I read Michael Sandel's book, What Money Can't Buy, and you know, there's the Israeli daycare study, and they define that people did it less. And I said, but that's a very specific mechanism, right? It was signaling to people that this is how much it costs when you come late. We're talking about, you know, paying health workers more or paying teachers more. But in fact, it was something that is then been used to justify keeping salaries low for public service delivery and taking incentives out of anything that has to do with social activity. And so, but you know, being on the ground, you realize that money actually can signal many different things. So even when you go back to this, you have to really ask yourself from each of these studies, what is the incentive signaling in terms of information? And that will tell you whether it could crowd out or crowd in and what the mechanism would be. And so this is a study where, you know, this is the only way that women have to protect themselves against HIV, female condoms in Southern Africa. Where should you distribute them? Where people are, in hair salons. Okay, but the question is, do you want to treat hairdressers and barbers like agents that you give a financial margin to and potentially crowd out their pro-social motivation for caring for their community? Or do you want to do something different? And so we thought we would test this. So we designed and implemented this field study, and we randomized this with Oriana Van and Kelsey Jack. This is the city of Lusaka. We GPS coded it, and we have 4 treatment groups. I can tell you much more about the details later, but if any of you are interested in doing incentive design experiments, all the spillovers and design, those are really crucial. So we looked for all of those. And then we did, you know, a 10% financial margin and a 90% financial margin, because one of the easy and interesting papers is about pay little or pay enough or not at all, because a little could be insulting. So that's why we have the 10%, the 90%, the pure volunteer, and then this non-monetary reward that we created to basically be a parallel of financial incentives. So every marginal effort you put in, this is connecting you to the marginal community impact. Totally symbolic. And we measure using an adaptive dictator game their baseline altruism towards the HIV cause. And then we track the sales of female condoms, which are sold at a subsidized price. And what we find is that, sorry, you don't see the full thing. This is just the breakdown by low donation and high donation. We find that the stars are twice as effective as any of the other margins. And even the highest financial margin was not that effective because, frankly, there were a lot of ways that hairdressers and barbers could make an extra buck. But turning that into something that connected them to the social impact they were having was just far more valuable to them by this way. And then when we do heterogeneous treatment effects by below median giving in the dictator game and above median giving, what you see is that both the stars and the high financial incentives seem to crowd in. So for the people that have the highest altruism, they're actually more motivating them rather than crowding it out. This isn't like the perfect test of crowd out. What you ideally want to do is, you know, give people some money and then take it away and then see what they do, you know. But it does help you to see, for the people who started out super motivated, does giving them some money change and make them demotivated? And that doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. And when, again, doing the qualitative work, what people said is we felt valued. And again, that money was signaling value. Okay, but that's sort of on the intensive margin. I'm going to end with a couple studies that are on the extensive margin, which is where a lot of the argument has been. You know, basically extracting from these lab and some field experiments into let's not pay for public service delivery. This is a paper by Dmitry and Rossi where they changed the salary of Mexican civil servants and found that they got higher quality candidates who were equally pro-social. So that was important. But, you know, given what Elizabeth was saying, it depends on when you end the evaluation. There was no performance evaluation here. It was just who applied and who accepted. And so what we did is in Zambia, this is with Oriana Bandera at Davenport, who's a PhD student that several of you know at MIT, and he was a pre-doc with me, and Scott Lee. And the goal was to train, so, you know, like in many countries in the world, there are not enough doctors there's 11 million people and 111 doctors, I think, in all of Zambia. So the idea is to upskill community health workers and help them serve the needs of the community. Most of the time, community health workers are asked to volunteer and to do it for the respect of the community. When we talked to the Ministry of Health, they were going to launch this new program of professionalizing this sector. And their fear was that once these guys became civil servants, that would change their connection to the community. And in particular, that it would draw in people who wanted, you know, the career success of being a civil servant and the money associated with it, instead of for the right of serving the community. So we said, great, let's test this out together. And in the pilot, we randomized across 48 districts in the country whether people saw a poster that emphasized the aspects of career. So these are both the same job, but just a different emphasis on the benefits that you get from the job. So on the right-hand side is career motives and, you know, accessing career opportunities, becoming highly skilled. And on the left-hand side is the kind of status quo, want to serve the community, become a community health worker, and the benefits associated with it. Everything else remained the same. And then when they applied and were chosen, they came on for a year of training. At that point, they were all told, you are part of an important cadre of civil service, you're going to have these career benefits, and you're going to be part of this incredible service corps. So the way you want to think about this is that the selection channel we were able to open, but shut down the treatment channel in terms of the incentives on the job, because everybody gets the same job. Now, the thing I want to mention is that this is not what we would call a light touch advantage, even though it looks like it's just a difference in posters. But what we're really going to look at when we look at the difference in outcomes is the selection of people who came in. And what we find over 18 months, so a lot of what these guys do is household visits. What you find is that those who were attracted by the career poster do 20,000 more household visits over this 18 months, 30% more. That's about the same kind of change you get when you move to a pay for performance incentive scheme on the job. But this is coming entirely through who you attract to the job. But then you could think, well, household visits, maybe they visit like the easiest to reach households, or maybe they don't work on the weekends, or maybe there's a whole bunch of other things that they could do. Or maybe it crowds out other activities that they're supposed to do. Turns out they do twice as many community mobilization meetings, they see as many patients. And then we do household surveys. And what's interesting is that the knowledge is actually the same across both treatments, but the actual practices of washing your hands and the effects on children's weight and height are much higher in the career treatment. So we have this on the policy, but I haven't talked a lot about this, but given that you guys are all interested in sort of policy discourse as well, we had to give results before we had the final results here. And because the government wanted to scale up. Like they've done this in the first pilot, they want to have 5,000 community health workers, which posters should you use? And we didn't exactly know, but we knew that we were getting really good candidates from the career poster. So the first year, in fact, they just merged the posters together. And then once we started getting these results, they scaled up with the career poster. And now this has become, for the World Health Organization, the best practice for community health workers. What does this tell us? The kind of lay intuition that monetary incentives can draw in the wrong kind of people isn't entirely wrong, but it's not right either. So let me show you how. You can think of two dimensions that you care about in public service delivery. We care about people's hearts and how pro-social they are, and we care about their heads, how competent they are at the job. Both are important. When you have low rewards, you attract people who are committed to the cause, but also don't have a lot of outside option in terms of the other things that they can do. So it's low talent, high pro-sociality. As you add the rewards, it's true that it happens that people who are, not as committed to the cause start coming into your applicant pool. But so do people who are very committed and have half a head. And then, as you increase the material rewards, you kind of move up. And the thing is, what you want is to make sure that you have this person in your pool. So what you care about is who shows up in your pool. And yes, it is true. This person will show up in your pool, and that's what everyone is scared of. But you don't have to choose that person. You choose this person. And in fact, you choose that person because in our case, because of the outside options that were there also, we're writing another paper about this, about kind of returns to talent across sectors. It turns out that the highest competent person is also the highest pro-social person because this is a pro-social job. Okay? And, just recruiting on the basis of that and drawing in people to come to the applicant pool that would not have otherwise come leads in this case to 25% lower malnourishment across Canada. So taking this all together, I hope I've shown you a few domains in which there's been a kind of two-way dialogue between development and behavioral. And like I said, most of it has been about testing and applying behavioral insights into development and showing that it matters. But increasingly, we're seeing the dialogue go the other way. And the hope is to keep that dialogue going. And one area that, is really close to my heart is about this idea of exogenous or fixed preferences. And, we didn't get into this, but the maternal mortality work really suggests that what initially looked like a very big difference in preferences between husbands and wives for number of children is actually a difference in beliefs about maternal mortality risk, which is much easier to change. So really, again, kind of getting under what is really going on. Is it preferences or is it beliefs? Is really important. Is it preferences or is it attention? What are the factors that affect attention? And then thinking about the processes through which, if it really is preferences, how preferences become endogenous. Doug mentioned the work that he has with others on the choice of preferences. We saw some work on kind of the capacity to imagine the future. And Oriana and I have an agenda on trying to think of altruism, unlike what I just showed you, not as types, but really as a skill that you build that we call altruistic capital. But in order to test that, we're now doing experiments in firms where we need like 10 years of data and lots of from the welfare point and all the domains in which they're active to look at crowd out.